Welcome, and thank you for joining us for another of GG+A's web series designed to help our clients and others respond to the pandemic. My name is Pete Lasher. I'm one of the leaders of GG+A's higher education practice, and I'm pleased to be joined today by Terrence Sawyer, Vice President for Advancement at Loyola University Maryland. We've been fortunate to interview a number of advancement leaders over the course of the series, and we're very excited to have Terry with us today. Terry's had a distinguished 20-year career at Loyola, beginning as Special Assistant to the President for Government and Community Relations and Trustee Affairs. He served as Vice President for Administration from 2004 to 2015, at which point he saw the light and became Vice President for Advancement. And in 2017, he was promoted to Senior Vice President, a promotion no doubt tied to the success of Loyola's Bright Minds, Bold Hearts campaign, which raised over $100 million for the university. Since the pandemic began, Terry's assumed another role for Loyola. In early summer, he was tapped by the president to lead the university's reopening efforts. With colleges and universities reopening across the country and in Canada in a myriad of configurations and with some mixed results, we thought it would be timely to hear from someone who is literally living the issues to help us understand the decisions and the decision-making process that our college and university leaders are undertaking to safely reopen campuses and to discuss the implications for fundraising. One note, we're hoping to respond to at least some of your questions live toward the end of the session, so please submit your questions in the chat function. We promise to answer them in the next few days if we run out of time today. Terry, great to have you with you. Before we begin, can you give us a sense for the current state of reopening at Loyola at this time?
Sure, and thanks, Pete. Thanks for that introduction, and it's great to be with you as well. The current state is that we are essentially online for the fall semester. We are having some undergraduate students live in the residence halls if they can present a compelling need to be here. That will result in somewhere between 50 and 60 students that'll be here in the residence halls. And some of our graduate programs will be in person. Most of them will be remote. And that was a decision that came after a lot of planning. And if you would have asked me just a few weeks ago what our situation would have been, I would have said with absolute certainty that we were opening, and then factors that we can discuss on this call caused us to change that decision.
Looking forward to exploring that. How did you find yourself in charge of the reopening efforts in the first place?
I asked myself that question quite a bit. You know, I think a couple reasons. I got a call, as you mentioned, in probably in early May. We had started our reopening efforts planning. I got a call from the president. He said, I need you to do me a favor, and it's going to be onerous. And that's a great thing to hear from your president. And he said, I'd like you to coordinate the reopening efforts. And I think it was a combination of the fact that, as you mentioned, I have not had a straight-lined career. I've kind of bounced around in different areas. I've overseen many different areas of the university over my 22-year career. So I have some understanding of how the university functions, which is important in understanding how you're going to sort of retrofit it to exist in a pandemic. And also, I think because I didn't have a direct stake, so to speak, in terms of I didn't oversee an area that would be dramatically impacted whether we were in person or not. So I think he felt that I could be somewhat agnostic to the decision, and it's a very Jesuitical approach to not go in with any preconceived notions, but start the exercise and see where we land in terms of what is ultimately the right thing to do. Do we reopen fully? Do we open partially? Do we go online? And that's the mindset that I had as I entered into this exercise.
So how have you approached what has clearly been an unprecedented undertaking?
Yeah, you know, again, I was surprised to be tasked with this, but happy to and eager to help the university. For me, and I think I learned this in law school, when you're faced with a complex situation, the best thing to do is break it into its simplest parts. So I looked at it in terms of 4 things we had to accomplish. I kept talking about it as legs on a table, and they all had to be the same length. And that would be you have to house them, you have to feed them, you have to educate them, and you have to take care of them. And so with those things in mind, we created teams and then critical questions under those headings of how are we going to do this? What are we going to do about that? What if this happens? And we figured out who would be the best people to sort of solve these questions. We sent them away, and then we would bring them back just about every week for a sort of a check-in to say, how are we doing on this issue? And then there became natural synergies that needed to happen. The group started working more together. But that was the approach we took. And again, I'm very proud of the fact that I think we ended up with a very solid, comprehensive plan leading into the first few weeks of August.
I'm curious as to how, given the fact that there is some urgency here as you describe those teams, how was that? Did everybody come to the table feeling that sense of urgency? I mean, it's in some ways it feels like it's a detached experience, but what was it that you were able to do to kind of keep people focused on what needed to be done?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was obvious to everyone how much was at stake, but I laid it out for everyone of how much it was at stake. Our initial premise was that we wanted to create a university where if a student, an undergraduate student, wanted to be here for an in-person experience, that we would accommodate that. And if a student, for whatever reason, their own, did not want to come here, but still wanted to keep pace with their degree, we would accommodate that as well. So that's the classic hybrid model that we were prepared to implement. It meant that we would not be able to have single occupancy, but we would have to de-densify the residence halls. We followed CDC guidelines as our floor. We also explained that while health and safety of our community has to be paramount, there is a dramatic impact if students do not come back and go online. And that's true for every school, but it's particularly true for us relative to the proportion of our budget that we get from auxiliary revenues. Of a school that has 4,000 undergraduate students, we only have a few hundred that live off of campus and less than 50 true commuters. So we are a very residential campus that relies heavily on revenues from room and board and fees. So we knew that if we went online, we would be foregoing those revenues, but we also knew that we had to lead and make decisions based on what we thought was in the best interest of the safety of our community.
So what were the major challenges, and then how were you able to overcome them?
Yeah, well, certainly one of the challenges was, and I think this was true of every school, is that we're trying to solve a problem or answer a question that's never really been asked before, at least not in our lifetime. How do we create a residential experience during a pandemic and run an in-person university during a pandemic? None of us were around during the Spanish flu. Loyola was. Not a whole lot of documents that we were able to find about how they weathered that, although they did. And to be honest, that was consoling. We talked a lot about the fact, because there's some panic that sets in. And like, are we going to be okay? Are we going to survive? And you point out, well, Loyola survived the Civil War, both world wars, the Spanish flu, and we're going to survive this, but it's going to take us to stick together and be innovative and creative to do it. So that was certainly a challenge. You've heard this metaphor, but it's absolutely true. We're trying to fix the plane while it's flying. There wasn't really time to, let's really reassess and do some strategic planning about how we do all this. So that was tricky. And Loyola, like many of our peer institutions, is not attached to a health system or a medical school. So you have to go search for good medical information and support. We were able to do that. We also got some help from our neighbor, literally less than a mile down the road, Johns Hopkins University, in terms of some of the information they were putting out. And I was able to consult with some colleagues there. But we needed to get a health partner. And so we eventually did that. But that's also, for a school like Loyola, puts you a little bit at a disadvantage because the information and the science was changing so quickly.
Yeah. So I'm interested in hearing about taking us inside the university's decision-making process and the steps ultimately that led you to determine you needed to go fully online. And if you wouldn't mind, take us into, you have a very thoughtful president at Loyola, and I just wondered if you could also kind of share a view through his lens as to, particularly given the Jesuit ideals of the university.
Yeah. Yep. Thank you for saying that. Our president, Father Linane, has been president for over 15 years. He is a very thoughtful Jesuit. But he let us do the work. I would meet with him regularly. That's the other thing. He wanted one point of contact. A lot of the VPs, I think, were, understandably going to him, and he just said, I just kind of want one point of contact around reopening. So that was me. And we would meet regularly, and he asked good questions, gave good advice, but he let the work be done. And in terms of the sort of inside the process of the decision making, as I mentioned earlier, I thought we had a very good plan, and we were able to control the things that we could control. Unfortunately, in the weeks towards the end of July leading to August, when we kind of knew if we're going to make a change, we're going to have to give parents some notice, because we were planning on moving students in right around now. A few things changed. First, cases in our area started to rise, particularly and most disturbingly among young people, and that made us concerned. The infection rate also started to rise. It was above 5% in the city of Baltimore, which we're located. The city of New York has announced they would close the entire public school system if it went over 3%. So that's not an enviable number. We thought maybe we could handle that. The White House task force on the coronavirus, 7 days in a row prior to us making the announcement of going online, listed Baltimore as a city of concern. Thank you, Deborah Birx. And maybe most importantly for us, definitely most important for us, the testing environment changed. We made the decision on a Wednesday night. That Monday, we got a call from our health partner that said, look, the 24 to 48 hour turnaround time on testing is not going to work out. It's going to be more like 5 to 7 days. And when we modeled that out, what we realized is we've all been through this, but if you have a move-in weekend and some students get together for a gathering, 20 kids, and then that Monday someone goes to the health center and says, you know what, I think I don't feel well and I have a fever. We have to assume that student has COVID. We test that individual, and we have to quarantine everyone that was with that person at the party. And we're not going to know if we can release them now for 5 to 7 days. That's one incident. Times that out towards several, and we're looking at a campus that at any given time has hundreds and hundreds of students in lockdown that require some level of case management or care, and that became paralyzing. The other thing, with each one of the bad data points that I listed, causes a countering mitigation effort. You stack those on top of each other, and you start to look at an environment that doesn't even come close to resemble what our students are used to and expect when they think about going back to college, particularly for first-year students, that it's a case of first impression for them. So I went to Father Linane that Wednesday with all these facts. I sent them to him, and he said, I'd like you to come over to the house. He lives here on campus. And we had a socially distant meeting on his porch. And it was a very sort of a moment I will not forget anytime soon. Because again, we were convinced that we're going to stick this out and we're going to make this work. And he said, you know, I remember when I came here when I was elected president, the summer before, I was starting in September, I moved in that summer, and I was walking around with a friend, and I saw all these families that were here for orientation. He said, and it hit me at that time, he's telling me this story, it hit me at that time that these people, these parents, are bringing to this university, and really to me, what is most important in their life. And I simply, in the face of what you're telling me, cannot take a risk with their safety. I've been entrusted with too much. Now, that is not to judge institutions that have gone in another direction, because it's a very unique, I do not think it's an irresponsible decision, but that's where we landed. And it was particularly the testing element, that we were just not in a good situation around testing. We would have run out of isolation beds very quickly. And for those reasons, we made the call. So we made the decision that Wednesday night, the board approved it Thursday morning, and we announced it noon on Thursday.
Terry, we talked earlier about what you think might make for a successful reopening on campus, this idea of the bubble. I wonder if you could just elaborate it. I know coming back in January, you're hoping that you'll be able to actually bring people back on campus. Can you just describe a scenario where you think that is going to actually work?
Yeah, I mean, there's a great podcast on the Journal or on the Daily, I think it is, about the MBA bubble and how successful that has been and how unbelievably costly and logistically challenged that is. Could you do that on a college campus? I don't know. We're in a relatively urban environment. We're like a suburban campus on the edge of a city. I think it would be hard to create that kind of bubble. I do think, however, that lessons are going to be learned this semester. And I think the student mindset, there's the potential that it changes in terms of, yeah, I guess I really need to adjust my behavior or else this isn't going to last very long. And I think we're seeing that at the schools that we all know about that have had to, that brought students back and then very quickly had to say, sorry, this isn't working the way we had hoped. So I think that, you know, a sort of a modified bubble is possible. I think that the testing environment can change between now and January. We're doing everything we can as a university and as a network of private universities, independent universities in the state of Maryland, to advocate for better testing in our state. I think that the possibility of the therapeutics that could come on board, not just the convalescent plasma that was introduced recently by the FBA, but the monoclonal antibodies that's being studied, and there's going to be results that come out in a few weeks. That could be, I hear from my public health and virologist friends, a real game changer that's being kind of underreported, given how much is at stake. All those things, or a combination of those things, could really create a different environment in January. I also think, and I'm praying for the schools that made the decision to bring students back, that it goes really well for them, because we're going to learn lessons from that. I want to model what we're going to do off of, hey, what worked at your place? You know, how did you pull it off? What were the few things that worked, or maybe the things that didn't work? These are real-time experiments. So all of those things combined will hopefully create an equation where we can bring students back in some form or fashion for the spring semester.
So many issues that you're contending with, and you've got all of these different constituencies that are paying such intense attention to what's going on. Students, parents, faculty, board members. What's been your strategy for communicating with these different groups, and how has the message differed for each one?
Yeah, well, you're right. There are many different constituencies. And one of the things I knew, Pete, going into this was, and it was sort of like, oh my God, what did I do to deserve this? Because I knew no matter what we did, it was going to be wrong to about half the people. We were getting, prior to even announcing a final decision, very passionate letters from parents and students. You better not reopen, you know, don't take a chance with our lives. And other parents saying, you know, you've got to, you know, show some guts. Don't believe the hype. We need our kids in school. Depression is up, you know, all these issues. And they're all fair points. So we knew that there was no right answer that was going to please everyone. Internally, same thing. I mean, you know, there were people that really understood the financial impact, but had very legitimate concerns about their own health. You know, and it's none of our business, but maybe they're vulnerable, or they live with someone that's immunocompromised. So a lot of strong feelings on all ends. So to answer your question, what did we do? We had 5 town halls. First, we announced it the way you have to announce something broadly. We sent emails out and tried to cloak them in sensitivity and thoughtfulness, but the reaction was hot. I mean, social media was just brutal. So it just felt like everyone was mad at us, quite frankly. So then we decided to have 5 town halls. We had 2 for internal audiences with the president and the entire president's cabinet, and I moderated it, all of them. And one was just for faculty because their issues are unique. The other internal town hall was for staff and administrators. And then we had 3 for students. We had 1 just for first years, 1 just for seniors, and then 1 for the sophomores and the juniors. And we allowed for questions in advance so we could kind of make sure we had the answers they needed. And then towards the end, we opened it up for questions. And there are certainly outliers to what I'm about to say. But for the most part, I think we moved sentiment in our favor, because I think they sensed that we were being honest, transparent, doing the best we can in a very difficult situation, that reasonable people could have absolutely disagreed on whether it was the right move or not the right move. But because we explained it and went through the methodology, we also dispelled some myths. It was like this social media movement that we somehow knew this all along, but this was like a coup to like make money, which we explained. This is not the strategy you would have used if you wanted to make money. We ended up losing a ton of money. So because I think we were transparent, open, and honest, and vulnerable, we got we changed the tide. The mood of the room definitely has improved. And some of the results that have come in are somewhat affirming to the decision. Again, I take no joy in that. I'm rooting for schools that brought kids back to succeed.
So the complications of that are mind blowing to me in those respects. And then you have this other population out there. You have this other population of donors. So let me kind of shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about the other hat that you've been trying to wear. And besides being a major distraction for you, how has the advancement effort been impacted by these developments?
Well, Pete, thanks for reminding me that I am still an advancement officer. I do need to be reminded of that from time to time. My staff would definitely say that. In the beginning of this whole issue, we did what a lot of other schools did, because a lot of our tools were no longer available. We were a little bit caught flat-footed. How do you engage with alums and donors when we can't go see them? And so we did the care calls and Zoom meetings and all that. What we're starting to do now, because we're at a good time, not a good time, but I guess as good of a time as you could be in. We're not in the middle of a campaign where, as you know, we are starting to think about the next campaign. We're preparing for a campaign. And so what we've started to do is we've come up with a series of questions that we've engaged donors around about, first of all, explaining where we are currently and what might Loyola look like at the end of this. This is going to end, pandemic's end. What's Loyola going to look like? What do we want it to look like? What could it look like? What would you like it to look like? And what are some of the obstacles you would see towards that? What are some of the opportunities you think we should take advantage of? And it's an interview of sorts, but a guided conversation that we're showing. First of all, in my view, Zoom calls now just to say hello are kind of over. But if you have a real purpose to a Zoom call, it can be as engaging as a face-to-face meeting. And so this is giving that purpose. We prep the folks in advance to be thinking about these things. And we're finding that they're sort of showing us what their interests are. They like being included. And it's not just window dressing. We're getting really good ideas, because this is a strategic question we're asking ourselves. What is it going to look like on the other side? And are there opportunities we need to be taking advantage of? And those have been really interesting, fruitful conversations, which, you and your audience are all advancement professionals. You ask people for money and they give advice. You ask them for advice and they give you money. They're raising their hand to say, I'm really passionate about this. And this is, I think, something Loyola should pursue. And so we're going to have follow-up conversations. And it could potentially lead sometime to a set of priorities that would yield into or turn into some type of a plan that would create the backdrop to the next comprehensive campaign.
Yeah, I want to touch on those priorities and specifically what you're raising money for now. But I just want to point out that there's something that's really fundamentally important about what you're doing. This idea of substantively engaging our donor populations in substantive conversations about the institution's future, I think is something we should be doing far more of. It becomes even more important during this virtual era where we just don't have the same arrows in our quiver that allowed us to cultivate people and donors in the past. So let me just validate what you're doing and saying I want to encourage all those who are listening that this kind of engagement is going to be super important, and then allows us to then lead to them putting up their hands and saying, here's where I might be willing to support you philanthropically. Terry, how have your fundraising priorities changed right now? Have they changed, I guess, is the question, and then how are you approaching donors or those who are raising their hands now, or how are you presenting your priorities to them?
Yeah, well, they have changed to some extent in that the need for need-based financial aid has grown dramatically. And so we started that last year fairly successfully with an emergency relief fund, which many schools did. And we were really kind of blown away by how successful that was, including from our parents. Many of our parents that wanted to, that would say sort of, we're in a position to help and we know not everyone is. And that was really humbling, quite frankly. But certainly an emphasis on additional funds around need-based financial aid. I think some schools maybe are pulling this off. We're pivoting away from an emergency relief fund. It doesn't really feel like an emergency anymore, but the imminence of it has sort of waned, but the need is just as severe, if not more. And we're having those conversations, and they've been going relatively well. In terms of other priorities that have changed, there were some, and I won't mention them, but there were some things that we were doing that we were raising money for that now seem kind of trivial in the face of all of this. And so we're moving away from some of those projects and focusing more on some of the things that I mentioned.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to ask a question about leadership lessons, but there's a question in our chat that I wanted to get your response to, and it's coming from a participant who sounds like they're bringing their students back to campus, and so now that donors hear that we're still having students on campus, they're not optimistic and respond like we are foolish for opening an in-person hybrid. When I see the challenges other institutions are having, I get less optimistic too. How do I handle this? Do you have any advice for them?
Well, I think it's that that every school, whether you decided to open or not open, and again, I think these are defensible positions, but you have to lay out in clear and understandable reasoning why you came to that conclusion, and then share it. Because again, as I mentioned, I think reasonable people can disagree. Even in our case, I don't know that it would have been absolutely irresponsible to open up, but you have to know your case. You have to understand your facts and why you came to that. And then you have to own it, and you have to be compelling and convincing and explain it. I found that there was a lot of people on the other side that were really mad at us. And when we sat down and actually explained it to people, they were kind of like, okay, I guess I get it. So I would say that in the inverse, if you're opening, explain why you opened, what you think the benefits are, why it's so important to have in-person learning, the things that you've put in place, the amount of PPE you've ordered, the amount of pieces of plexiglass you ordered, the 19,000 gallons of hand sanitizer you have on campus, the symptom checker you're using. Make the case and say, look, we're going to give this a shot. And if it doesn't work, then we'll have to readjust. But we think we can pull this off. But you have to own it, and you have to believe it.
So Terry, it begs the question of your frontline officers and how you have prepared them to be able to have these conversations. Were they participating in the town halls? Did you provide them with talking points? How did
So I meet with, I've been doing, this is a little bit of a teaser to the leadership lessons that I think you're going to ask me about. But, I've been doing increased communication. One of the things that I think is hard for all of us in this virtual environment is with each week that goes by, you run the risk of being a little more diffuse in terms of your feeling of community, which is so important for our institutions. It's what we love about them. It's there's just a charism to all of our schools that can kind of get diluted in this online environment. So I've been trying to be really intentional about bringing people together, even when there's not that much to talk about. And so my philosophy is that everyone that works in advancement needs to be an expert on Loyola. I expect you, when someone says, hey, what's going on at Loyola? You better not say, well, I don't know. I mean, you better know exactly what's going on at Loyola, because you are the face to lots of people. So I've been keeping them updated on step by step, kind of bringing them in the room, so to speak, because that's what people were asking about over the summer and into last spring. What's going on? What are you guys going to do? And I expect people to know. So, and yes, they participated in all the town halls. And I've wanted them to be informed so they can talk to donors and others about what's going on here on the ground.
Okay, we've got a minute left, so I want to make sure we get to those leadership lessons. But what have you learned that you want to share with the audience?
The first thing is something we're hearing a lot about right now on the national stage, and that is the importance in difficult times to display authentic empathy. What I think worked in our communication strategies to get people sort of on our side, if you will, is that starting with the president, and it's empathy in different ways, empathizing with people that are scared about the future of their job. Am I going to be furloughed? How are we going to make up for all this revenue that we lost? Empathizing with that anxiety, explaining, I don't have all the answers, but we know this is tough, and you have to trust that we're going to do everything we can to treat this community the way it deserves to be treated, with your best interest and the best interest of the institution at heart. And also with parents and students, explaining, we know you're heartbroken. It breaks our heart to not have you come back. We miss you. Those kind of messages are important and they resonate, and I think they help keep community together. The second and last thing is, in a crisis, it's so trite, but man, and I find this to be true. You simply cannot over-communicate in these situations, because people will fill any void with the worst case scenario. And so you have to communicate, over-communicate. We're going to do town halls every single month between now and January. And some months we're going to have a lot to talk about, and others we're not, but that's okay. We have to be reminding people that we hear you, we're with you, we understand your issues, and we're here to try to respond the best that we can. So those are my 2 quick takeaways in my last 30 seconds.
Great. This has been super valuable. I feel like we could go on for another session on this. And I just want to thank you, because this has been so valuable to us. And I want to thank everybody else for joining us as well today. We are all learning from each other during this remarkable time. We didn't get to all the questions. We'll be sure to post answers on our website. In the meantime, please contact us if you have any questions, and obviously we'd love to talk with you. Thank you again, Terry, and thank you to everyone.
Thanks, Pete.